I want to welcome you to the quorum on behalf of the team, Vivek Narayan, myself, and the rest of the team of the quorum. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Saloni Puri, and I lead the programming team that curates programs like this for you here in Hyderabad, in Mumbai, and in Gurgaon. In Mumbai, Hyderabad, and Gurgaon. And I want to, right at the beginning, ask for forgiveness from my voice because I'm quite ill. I have what we all call the Delhi viral, which everybody seems to have. But I'm going to push through it and take a little bit of your time to introduce this evening, to introduce our guests, and to introduce our topic. Can I first have a little show of hands? How many of you watched the Harris-Trump debate yesterday? Not bad. And can I get a voice vote? Did you think? How did you think Kamala did? Did she knock it out of the ballpark? How many of you think she did? One, yeah. More yeahs, yeah. And how many of you think that Trump did a good job, or at least held himself together? Oh, that's interesting. Well, I mean, the point being that I'm trying to make is even if we are not very political, at this stage of our lives, we are very interested in the Indo-US election. I'm sorry, the US elections. See, that's the Dolo speaking. The US elections. And that brings me to the topic for today, which is I call it Shifting Sands. And why I say that is because in the course of diplomatic relations, you will find that rivals become allies, sour friendships become sweet, foes become friends, and sometimes sanctions become state visits. And so therefore shifting sands. And a little bit of context, be patient with me, I will speak a little slowly. I thought I'll give you a little bit of context before we get into the actual conversation. There has been a marked transformation in Indo-US relationships, in the Indo-US relationship in the past 20 years. And I want to give you a little context. It was never like this. In 1998, we were a sanctioned nation. If you remember the nuclear testing during Vajpayee, in fact, from 1974 onwards, we were a sanctioned nation. And if I were to take you back even further to the 1971 Indo-Pakistan War, at that time, the American president was Nixon. And from what I have learned, he did not like Indira Gandhi. And he was very much supporting the Pakistani side of things. In fact, he sent a US warship into the Indian Ocean. And I don't know if Mr. Shingla knows this, but this is a little bit of FAQ that I picked up. He sent a US warship into the Indian Ocean, and it was only by the entry of a Soviet Union nuclear submarine that came out into the Bay of Bengal that things were deterred. So all through the Cold War, India was not really particularly a pal of the United States of America because of our own policy of non-alignment. But the sands shifted. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. Pakistan receded. And China emerged. And actually, it was during Kargil in 1999 that the United States of America made a very strong first move of showing its new position within India when Bill Clinton called up Nawaz Sharif during Kargil and pulled him up. And then Clinton became one of the first US presidents to come to the Parliament of India and speak in our parliament, and he exhorted how we were democratic nations tied by democratic values. And it is that theme that is now running till now. And as recently as, actually before I jump a little ahead, I must tell you about what I have learned is a tipping moment in India and United States relationship, and that was under the Bush administration, and that was the signing of the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. Remember, till then we were sanctioned nations, we were nuclear pariahs. And by the signing of this very, very important agreement, the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, in 2008 under the Bush administration, we came out of our nuclear apartheid. And then, of course, things got better from then onwards. Under the Trump administration, there is a term that I learned that India got bumped up to, and I think it's called STA1 level, which means Strategic Trade Association Level 1. And this was only given by the United States to its NATO allies. So we became the third actually Asian nation to get this bump up, by which we can now trade much more openly with the United States of America. And then further to that, last year, actually in January 23, our national security advisors, I think Jake Sullivan from the US and Ajit Doval from India, met and signed a very important agreement, a critical and emerging technologies agreement under Biden's administration. And that allows India to access absolutely state-of-the-art technology in artificial intelligence, in space technology, in quantum computing, in clean energy. So we've really come a long way, right? But the sands always shift. And that's why we watch the United States upcoming elections very, very carefully. And that's why we ask the question, will there be continuity in change? And it's a question that has to be asked also for our neighbor Bangladesh, who has gone through a coup and a regime change. So, and who is being wooed by the Chinese, by the Pakistanis, even by the Americans. Where does India stand in all of that? And the person and the people to help us depack, deconstruct, understand all of the stuff that I have led up to are Indrani Bagchi and Ambassador Harshvardhan Shringla. Ambassador Shringla has been a foreign secretary, has been the ambassador to the United States of America, has been a high commissioner at Bangladesh, has been the chief coordinator of our G20 under India's presidency. And he is best placed to take us through the US elections and our relationship with the United States of America and even Bangladesh. And I'm thankful to him for accepting my invitation, and thank you so much for joining us today. And adding to the gravitas is Indrani Bagchi, who is an extremely senior journalist whose beat has always been international affairs, a diplomat, international diplomacy, who spent a long time at the Times of India, India Today, Economic Times, The Statesman, and now she heads a not-for-profit think tank, a very respected one called the Aspen Center. So sorry for taking up so much of your time, but now to the chief guests of the evening, Ambassador Shringla and Indrani Bagchi.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here. In some ways, I look at the India-US relationship as going between Ambassador Sood to Ambassador Shringla. Because he had really the tough years when he was negotiating our relations with the US post the nuclear tests. And Ambassador Shringla for moving us to STA1, Tier 1, when he was in the US. So taking off from the presidential debate of yesterday morning our time, Ambassador Shringla, would you be in a position to wager a bet on who might make it to the White House in November?
Thanks, Indrani, and it's great to be here on the Quorum show. Well, I'm not a betting person, but I did get up early in the morning to watch the debate yesterday. And, you know, if you look at past history of debates, I don't think they've determined who really succeeds in the presidency. You've had people who've really done badly in debates and won. You have people who've done very well, like Hillary Clinton, and actually lost the presidency. So it's difficult to really go by the debate. I think what's very clear is that Kamala Harris did hold her own. There was an expectation that she might, some of the limitations of her candidacy would be exposed during the debate. For example, that she's avoided any press interviews. She avoided really coming out and speaking on issues that are important. She's left a certain measure of ambiguity. And I think that's understandable considering that she shifted her position on many critical issues, whether it is on the legality of cross-border immigration, or on the issue of fracking, or health insurance, or arms control for that matter. So she's nuanced her position, I think moved more towards the center. But any movement, any overt, I would say, change in position from 4 years ago to now would require a fair deal of explanation. And as I think the economists pointed out, that it shows a lack of conviction and a certain lack of, I would say, ideological positioning, because if you are able to shift on positions which are very critical to the US elections, then you could be exposed. But the fact is she was not exposed because she never got down to explaining her positions, and Trump was so busy defending his own issues, because I think she was very astute in a number of barbs that she threw at him. I think that was part of the strategy. It was expected. Trump was warned about it. I believe even J.D. Vance told him that avoid being drawn into or being provoked. But he was provoked. And the one thing that provoked him very seriously, and everybody knew that was his weak point, was the turnout in his rallies, and especially people leaving early. And she said that, there are leaders who are laughing at you. There are generals who say you're a disgrace. She, I think, spoke about his rallies. She, I think, baited him on a number of occasions. And what is, I think, interesting is that he fell for that bait. He reacted, he responded quite vociferously every time she raised an issue. And I think that wasted not only his time, but I think that really played into her game plan of not having to be on the dock herself on issues that were critical to US, I would say, opinion before the presidential race. So clearly the jury thought that Kamala Harris did better. I think she did very well. But as someone said, that she won the bout, but it wasn't a KO, it wasn't a knockout. So from that point of view, I think she did well, but there could be another debate. And I think we still have time. So I think it's still early in the game to pronounce ourselves. But I think if Kamala Harris continues this way, she obviously has a good shot at it, which wasn't expected even, a few weeks ago.
She has more money. She has sort of picked up a lot more funding than Trump. She didn't knock him out of the park, but she did fairly well. And I think Trump also suffers from the fact that he is now the old man of the election. It used to be Biden, it no longer is, and it's now Trump. I think that bothers him a bit. I think what also people who were watching that debate looked at the fact that Kamala Harris did not actually weigh in on the economy, on inflation, on the prospects. But what we all need to understand, I think, is the fact that it's not really the popular vote. The Democrats have always won the popular vote. It's the Electoral College. And in the battleground states, which in this case would be Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, what are your thoughts on how Trump might fare there?
So you're right, because it's the Electoral College that matters in the US. It's not necessarily the popular vote. Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, but she lost the elections. Yeah. So it's Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but also Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina. So there are 7 swing states that actually determine who wins the US election. And the swing states, I think, are very critical to this. We've been seeing surveys, and some surveys, I wouldn't take them exactly at face value because the mainstream media is for Kamala Harris. Let's be very clear on that. Mainstream media seems to indicate that the swing states favor Harris post-debate. And the swing states are very critical here in every way. I think both candidates will be spending a lot of time, but also money. I think you're right in saying that the amount that you actually raise for your campaign is probably more important than the debate. The money that you have is important. And in America, I think any politician who has more money than the other guy is likely to win. Congressmen, slightly detracting. Congressmen, have a short term. Now, from the time they get elected, they have to start raising money all over again because that money that you raise is very critical to get you elected in the next term. So here, I think the fact that Kamala Harris is doing well in raising funds, I think is a sign that she has a lot of support. I would say people are willing to put their money behind her. And I think that might really count more than the debate and in terms of how she fares going forward, because she can take out more ads, she can buy, more opinions. Taylor Swift just endorsed her. Not that she paid her any money, I suppose not. But as she says that...
She couldn't afford Taylor Swift.
Childless and with...
Childless cat lady.
Cat lady. And Elon Musk said, I'll give you a child and I'll take care of your kittens. But that's a different thing, yeah.
But going back to you, Harsh, you actually have had personal interactions with both candidates. Not too many people can say that. And because you've dealt with President Trump and you've dealt with Kamala Harris as VP. What has it been like?
So...
and don't be diplomatic.
Don't be shy, yeah, okay. Trump was, I was ambassador when under his administration. So I had a more, I would say, ringside view of Trump and his policies. And I got to meet him more than what normal ambassadors do because we had such a level of interaction. When you mentioned Ambassador Sood, you're right in saying that was the time in which we were really, defensive. And when I was there, I think we had incredible access. You could meet anybody in the US. You could meet senators, congressmen, governors. You could even go up to the White House and meet anybody short of the president. So the fact of the matter is that you got a lot of face time with a lot of these people. So if I were to describe Trump, and his policies in just two words, I would say, unpredictable, that's for sure. And the other is that he was basically transactional. So unpredictable and transactional. These are the two terms that I would use. Unpredictable in the sense that his decisions would come in and take you by surprise. You didn't know where they were coming from. And you didn't know. You see, normal presidencies, you have an entire system that works around you. The swamp, the entire Washington ecosystem. So you have inputs that come in from the State Department, from the Pentagon, from the agencies. His advisors advise him, and then the president takes considered views. Trump took decisions with a level of spontaneity. And there are a number of decisions that took us by surprise. And when you are taken by surprise, it's not very good for any ambassador's career. So it got me a little worried in the beginning.
Harley Davidson.
Yeah, well, trade was one of those issues. But I'll give you two examples where he took us by surprise. One was on the issue of exemptions from Iranian oil purchases. We had an exemption that the Trump administration had given us.
Obama
administration. Yeah. So essentially that continued under Trump for some time. But one day, and we were engaged with his closest aides on this issue. And everybody assured us that your exemption would continue because we understand why you need Iranian oil. But one fine day, the exemption was removed. And I think our leadership took it with a certain level of equanimity. They said, look, if that's the decision, then we have to adjust around it and we do what it takes. So we moved forward. And the other was the removal of the GSP benefits, generalized system of preferences. We had about $6 billion market access for handicrafts and things. But then he also took decisions that affected others adversely, but that benefited us. And one of those decisions was to raise tariffs on Chinese products by 25%. So $300 billion of Chinese products was subject one fine day to a 25% tariff increase. So I was very fortunate in being able to point out to Delhi that, look, we've lost 6 billion, but we've gained some 20 billion because a lot of areas where the Chinese were competing with us were areas where 25% made that huge difference. So we were able to recover. But, I mean, we worked hard on that relationship. I think by the middle of my term, I'd figured out what were the levers that got us or got our opinions to resonate with him.
So why did we not get a 2 a.m. tweet? Every other country in the world got a 2 a.m. tweet that consigned them to the devil. Why did we not get that tweet?
So that's what I think we got the measure of him. And what really works for him is family. It's not, everybody else is an employee, so you can be fired. And so his favorite theme was "You're fired." I mean, General Mattis, who was his defense secretary, very senior, Marine Corps general. One fine day, Trump fires him, and he said, Mattis is as dumb as a rock. And this is on the tweet. So, I mean, you can sort of have anything. But I think what happened was that we did get to know some of his close family members. We were able to pass on messages. We were able to make that difference. And he actually listened to family. But just to finish that earlier question about the personalities, Trump, I think, could be handled because, you had to know his sensitive points and his pain and, pleasure areas. And I think when we had the Howdy Modi event in which Prime Minister Modi came down and they jointly addressed 50,000 Indian Americans, that's something that's never been done. In America, a successful rally has 15,000 people. So Trump was amazed to see this huge group of voters because they're all US citizens. And of course, he asked the Prime Minister, he said, how many people come to your rallies? So the PM said, sometimes 100,000. So he said, the next time I come to India, I want to see this. So when he came, and that time I was Foreign Secretary in 2020, we took him to Ahmedabad. And in Ahmedabad, he had, I think, the most effusive welcome that he's ever had. Even in the United States, he's not had that sort of a welcome. Right from the airport down to this stadium, we had 100,000 people packed in for this Namaste Trump event. So Trump was very chuffed. And if he were to come back, I think we have the measure of him. He's going to regard us really, really in a positive way. Kamala Harris is a different cup of tea. She's avoided contact with India consciously. She's not met any visitor from India. She's not met any of our ambassadors there. And there's a very simple reason for that. I mean, she is conscious of the fact that she has to be portrayed as of African-American origin because that's where the vote bank is. And Trump also tried to play on that point when he said that you were Indian earlier, but now you're African-American. So she's consciously shifted from Indian roots to African-American roots. And I think, she's a politician and she has to do what it takes. She, of course, has made a few statements that were awkward earlier.
Yes.
On JNK when abrogation of Article 370. When she was asked by, I think, the India Abroad magazine, which is a NRI magazine in the US, that, can you tell us about her Indian origin? She said, we are the sum of many factors. So she wanted to avoid saying that I'm of Indian origin. And the Washington Post had a recent article in which they said that in 2019, when she came on the scene, then there was a lot of interest and even some euphoria in India around her. But since then, that has waned. India is seeing her differently. I'm just quoting Washington Post. I mean, this is not my view. And it says that her connection with India is more muted now. And not only that, but there is a concern that about her strategic, let's say, view with regard to India. Now, that's the Washington Post. The PM, I've been in meetings when the Prime Minister has met Trump, but I've been also in a meeting where the Prime Minister met Vice President Kamala Harris. A good meeting, good optics, good symbolism, and I think good connect. a good symbolism and good meeting. I don't know about the connect. And I think he met her the second time when he went last year.
Yes.
But that was only at the dinner.
Yes.
And where she made a few remarks. So one of the reasons I think interest has waned also is that she's not visited India. If you notice in the debate, she says, I've traveled across the globe, but that traveling doesn't include India. Will her policies bother us? If you want, I mean, can I say a bit on that?
Yeah.
So, you know, there's been a track record, right? She said a few things which have been awkward, but not too. I mean, politicians say things and you have to take positions. When I was there, we were troubled greatly by this group within the Democratic Party called the Progressives.
The squad.
Left of the center, the squad, Ilhana Omar and Rashida Tlaib. I think Rahul Gandhi just went and met Ilhana Omar. But they were troublesome to say the least. And Pramila Jayapal, Congresswoman from Seattle, initiated a resolution that was completely one-sided, you know, tended to just put us on the dock on practically everything. So what it seems is that Kamala Harris is pretty beholden to this group, you know, the left of center. The trade unions, she mentioned the union workers in her speech a couple of times, a debate. She's beholden to the progressives. One of the reasons, I'm told, I mean, I don't know, we hear, I mean, we only read in newspapers and other places, is that she chose Tim Walsh over Ed Shapiro was pressure from this group. So will this group sort of exercise the sort of influence on her as president that could in some way impact on the relationship, vitiate the atmosphere? That's the issue.
But if I may interject, you know, a part of the squad actually didn't get past the primaries, except for Ilhan Omar. They didn't get past the primaries this time. And on the other hand, Trump described her as a Marxist. I mean, she's clearly part of the progressive group, as you said, and she's clearly much more left-leaning than Trump. Although I noticed this morning she endorsed the entire oil and gas industry in Texas, which is interesting when it comes to the whole sustainability debate. But how much of a left-leaning progressive in the American sense president do you think Kamala Harris might be?
So you're right in saying that the progressives might be running out of steam.
Yeah.
They were very popular, you know.
I saw all the Jewish money went to defeat most of the squad.
Absolutely. I mean, that is a factor. But I think they have essentially overdone themselves, and that you know, is not resonating well with the electorate. But the fact is that, you know, there is a difference between positions that you take as a politician and the position that you take when you're president of the United States. Because don't forget, there's that entire system behind you. And it's very difficult to buck the trend. And Trump tried to do it a number of times. He succeeded also, but I think it didn't resonate well. You know, whether it's the Pentagon, whether it's the CIA, whether it is the FBI, whether it is State Department, whether it is his own setup in the White House, there's a lot of inputs that go to the president. And his decision is a very considered decision based on all these inputs. It's very difficult to buck the trend. I mean, Ukraine, for example, I mean, if you see the conflict, I was of the view that, you know, when Trump talks about the fact that I will sort of make sure that conflict ends within a week's time, you know, that's one thing to say it. But the fact of the matter is that the system might make it very difficult for that change in policy to happen, even for someone like Trump. He comes in, he finds that the system is so, the momentum and the I would say, background behind which all of this is presented is so strong that it's very difficult to change that momentum. So Kamala Harris might, although in my view she is left of center, she's not at the center. Biden is center, he was centrist. And so despite the fact that we had this great equation with Trump, which I think we were very anxious about in 2021 when he took over, he made it a point to say that the India-US relationship is the defining partnership of the 21st century. So Biden attached a lot of importance to India on strategic considerations, and he did not allow many of these irritants from within his own party and the left of the party to, let's say, vitiate or distract attention from the relationship.
So, Kamala Harris is, of course, and we have to admit the possibility that she might actually be president. And you just said that she was described as somebody without convictions. In a sense, does that make it easier to influence a person like her? Because if we had somebody like Bernie Sanders who was ideologically committed, it might have been much more difficult. But for a person without too many convictions, would that be easier to influence? And if that is so, from the point of view of India, what are your major points of influence?
So I think that's a very, very significant point, is that she tends to move with the requirement. I mean, with the, let's say, imperative that is before her. So if in 2019 it was expedient of her to say that fracking should be banned, but now that she's going for the presidency and you have Pennsylvania as a swing state, she believes that fracking is perfectly fine. Again, I mean, if she was, had a position that was very, strong on, say, the Middle East, if you heard her, she said that Israel had the right to defend itself, that it was imperative to have a ceasefire, but it was important to assure security for both Israelis and Palestinians, and that there should be a two-state solution. So she's tried very hard to, again, go to the center. She's under pressure from the Palestinians, but she doesn't want to alienate the Jewish lobby. So any presidency will have expediency, but in her case, I think it is a little more than what it is in the normal course. And yes, so she would be susceptible to influences. And I think that plays out because America is full of checks and balances. In the White House has a position, you can get Congress to come in for you. Congress has a position, you can get opinion from, say, the states, like us, a federal structure. So there are opinions that states have. And you should, I think, in diplomacy, use every leverage that you have. The community is actually our strongest leverage in the United States, because anywhere where there is a congressman or a congresswoman who's, against you for some reason, you can always neutralize that opinion by tapping into that community. It might be a small community, because everywhere you don't have significant communities, but that community matters. I mean, if you can get that group of people to go to their congressman and say, this is not correct, and we want you to, show some adjustment in your position, I think that is something that they're very sensitive to. So you can always get Congress to come in. I found that even with Trump, one fine day when Imran Khan met him, he said that I'm happy to mediate on J&K. So we had to get Congress and the whole range of congressmen and senators who put out tweets and statements saying that this is absurd. The man is completely mad. Someone actually said he is completely off his rocker, which suited us at that time because, he'd taken a position that took us by surprise. So he is susceptible. He's susceptible to individual influences. She's susceptible to policy level influences. And I think either way, you can use that to your advantage. And I presume the entire conversation is off the record, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Not that I've committed myself pretty. Yeah.
So I remember when in the first year of the Trump presidency, one of the things that India did was actually invite Ivanka Trump to India. She was our first visitor. She, I think, was there was
World Economic Forum.
Yes, in Hyderabad, where she even had a meeting with the Prime Minister and all of that. And that's a family thing, as you said, works with Trump. Are there any people around Kamala Harris who we can influence, who India can influence?
Absolutely. Entire Silicon Valley ecosystem has been supporting her. And we've got some very good friends of ours.
She's a big tech...
But she's from California, so, there is a affinity there. We've got a lot of our friends who definitely have come out in a big way, with their checkbooks for her. And those people can definitely exercise, some influence on her.
So going forward, and this is my last question before I open it up to the audience. If you were to look at dispassionately at the India-US relationship, in a new administration, what should be our top billing? I mean, we've gone through years of high-tech cooperation, to defense cooperation, to nuclear, to STA-1, to what have you, to ISET. What is there? Do we need a big ticket, a big nuclear deal like project, or is there something that we have left off in these last few years that you think we should focus on in the next presidency?
Well, one thing is, I think for certain, is that the relationship is, based on a perception of joint and shared strategic interest. So I'm quite happy to say that irrespective of who becomes president, I think that relationship is going to be preserved and the momentum is going to be taken forward. So whether it's Obama, whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, and if Kamala Harris comes in, I think there will be that momentum that will take us forward. And you're right in saying that we really need to think of what should be the next steps in our strategic partnership with the United States. I mean, with every administration, we've thought of something which is a very major move forward. Technology, I think, is the initiative on critical and emerging technologies, which Saloni referred to, is I think a major leap forward. The fact that the United States can share the GE-144, which is the cutting-edge engine for a light combat aircraft, is a huge step forward in terms of sharing of critical technology. So can we do something which is not only defense and technology, can we do some joint programs that would enable us to take that relationship, not the relationship, but our, let's say, collaboration. Right now we are purchasing stuff, but can we collaborate right from the drawing board onwards, and can we build something which is cutting edge and state of the art?
So that was what ISET was designed for, but I think you'd need to inject some caffeine into ISET.
So ISET provides a framework on which you can, share technology, etc. The fact that most US Fortune 500 companies have R&D centers in India itself indicates that we are collaborating in a certain way. So how can you take that ecosystem and use it, in a collaboration that is government to government in nature? That's the point.
Questions and comments, and while we're waiting for it, I'm going to say one thing, which is, 20 years ago, we had something called the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership, which is the NSSP. And 20 years later, we are still talking about collaborating in cutting-edge technologies. There is clearly a hurdle that prevents us from reaching finish line. If you had to identify that hurdle, what would it be? I know what Ambassador Sood would say, because we've written millions of stories on this subject. But would it be export controls? Would it be the hesitation on export controls, on the rules that govern sharing of technology by both the DOE, the DOD?
So,
or the private sector?
There's a fellow diplomat and scholar called Dennis Cox, who said that we have moved, India and the US has moved from being estranged democracies to engaged democracies. And that's happened in a matter of 20 years. So 20 years is not such a long time. That period has been used progressively for the building blocks in the relationship. So we've gone from, the foundational agreements, say, in defense and technology and all the other areas, to today we're still signing agreements that are, let's say, at the top of the chain. We just signed the SOSA and the liaison thing, which is basically allows both sides to devote critical resources in the event of any emergency. If there is a conflict or war, both sides can immediately provide resources. When we had the conflict in Ladakh, we needed winter clothing on a very urgent basis because our troops are going to be in high altitudes in winter. I'm just giving examples. So essentially, that sort of cooperation is what is necessary. So we're still working on those, and it takes a bit of time to reach that stage where so at every stage we've done more and more and more. But I think every presidency and every sort of cycle of election is an opportunity to look at the next step. So it has to be progressive, it's building blocks. And I think, we can't take the relationship for granted because at any stage, you're right that you could have impediments that could come in. It could be in many forms. I referred to some possible impediments, but you could have them in more than one way. I was at a debate yesterday, sort of a discussion at the Asia Society, and the Japanese chap said that we might have a bit of a problem because, Trump may go and work out a deal with China, so where would that leave us? So, I mean, you don't know where it's coming from, so you have to keep your eye on the ball.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Sood because he's had a long experience. There were all these strange names that we knew then, but go ahead.
Well, in some ways it was easier in the 1990s when we started engaging with the United States because the Cold War had ended. And so, but for both of us, it was a way of kind of exploring how to talk to each other. We hadn't spoken to each other, as you reminded us, 1971, Bangladesh. So, but then what had happened was that the nuclear issue had become,
So big.
had gained a huge amount of momentum, legacy. There was a whole sort of weight around it. And once we were able to get that out of the way, that opened up many other avenues. I mean, that is what led to the whole explosion in defense cooperation. And, we went through the NSSP in 2004. We went through the DTTI, Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, during the Obama administration.
2015.
We ended up now with ISET. So in a sense, we are still looking for the big ticket item, as it were. But I don't think you'll find that kind of a big ticket item like the nuclear thing. The nuclear thing had consumed us. It had become, it was something that had to be taken out of the way because the US had led the sanctions on us, both in '74 as well as in 1998. So that's one. The second thing that I would just like to add is that, see, since World War II, the US has been a hegemon, a leader of an alliance. From 1945 onwards, it was leader of the West. Okay? And after Soviet Union collapsed, it was seen as a unipolar moment. So it was leader of the world. Whatever it said went. And now that there is a return of geopolitical rivalry, one of the first things we need to understand is that the US has never dealt with somebody who's... So the US divided the world into two kinds of countries. One was allies, and all allies, right from UK, Japan, Germany, France, whatever, Belgium, etc., were all junior partners. So they dealt with them as junior partners. And the second was adversaries. So you had the Soviet Union as an adversary. You had communist countries as adversaries. Today you've got China as adversary, you've got North Korea, you've got Iran. The US sees things very much in that kind of...
With us or against us?
Yes. Now, we are neither an ally nor an adversary, certainly not. So I think we end up spending a lot of time in trying to understand how we talk to each other and engage with each other. And that's where, as Master Shringla said, the more levers of engagement we have, you know, whether it is diaspora, whether it is the economic engagement, whether it is the defense engagement, whether it is the S&T community, whether it is the startup on critical and emerging technologies, the better it is, because that is how we'll get things going.
Exactly. That's true. Anybody wants to intervene? You want to? Go ahead.
So, building on what Sir said and Ambassador said, I think Kamala Harris in a debate yesterday said that she's pro-war.
She's pro-war?
Pro-war.
Yeah.
She said that if Russia is not taken care of, what will happen to the 800,000 Polish Americans when Russia eyes Poland once it defeats Ukraine? Whereas Trump was anti-war. He said his first thing was, I will do an agreement with both of them. Both are friends. So where does that leave India if Harris does come through and wins with India's engagement with Russia and Kamala Harris on an anti-Russia spiel? Where does that leave India? Because India's, I believe, armaments, a lot of it is sourced from Russia only.
Well, we've come down from 80% to 60%, and think even further below. I think that's actually less of a problem. But the fact that the war, a continuation of the war, makes life very difficult for us. But Ambassador?
No, that's a very pertinent question, because I think she was very clear that if we don't stop our effort, then Russia could go beyond Ukraine. It won't stop at Ukraine, and therefore we have to take this war to its logical conclusion, which means that it would go on for a number of years. Yeah, and that is not in our best interest. I mean, the fact that Prime Minister Modi went to Russia and went to Ukraine and met the two presidents is an indication of our desire to see an end to this conflict. And it's not only our desire, but it's the desire of the entire developing world, because in an interlinked and interdependent world, a conflict thousands of kilometers away can impact on all these small countries, and you can be devastated, your economy can be devastated by the consequences of conflict, whether it's inflation, rise in essential imports, remittances, tourism inflows. So I think this is an important factor. And I think it's important for the US also to understand that this sentiment is not a sentiment just carried by India or some of the, let's say, middle countries, middle powers, whether it's Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, but it cuts across, the developing world. So other than Europe and the United States, and perhaps Japan and a few other allies, which Master Sood referred to, there's not that much support for this effort. But if Kamala Harris does come in, I think we will have to have a separate outreach on this issue. Soon after the Ukraine conflict broke out, and our position became clear that we were not going to be, taking sides in this conflict, that we would look at it from a position of strategic autonomy and our own national interests. President Biden convened a summit meeting of the Quad leaders. And in that meeting, he said that I can understand where India is coming from. We understand the rationale behind India's position. And also, I can assure you that this conflict will not mean that we will take our focus away from the Indo-Pacific, which means China, basically. So Biden came out in a very, I would say, responsible way, but obviously some effort had gone in also to convey a point of view. But we'll have to do the same thing, I think, with Kamala Harris and her administration. My sense is that the same people who are around Biden will not be there with Kamala Harris. We'll have to start from scratch. And we will have to, I think it will be a diplomatic challenge to get this group also around to a similar understanding. Otherwise, it might impinge on the relationship, because, the fact that Biden came out and said he understood our position actually helped us in moving along. Otherwise, there could be a gap. And I think, again, one of our Japanese colleagues who spoke at the Asia Society said that, he said, a Quad is going to face its own difficulties because India's position is a discordant position, it's different from the rest of Quad. And how will that impact on Quad as we go along? But I don't agree with that view because the Quad is supposed to focus on the Indo-Pacific. It's not Europe focused. But having said that, there are these points of view that are coming out. And I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that there might be a fresh challenge here. And I think that's why I think that point is a very good one.
One more thing I wanted to add. Apart from this, with Saudi joining BRICS, and there's talk of an alternate settlement currency for oil, that threatens the US hegemony in a full-fledged frontal way. So is that something which India is pursuing strongly, and this will this also be a challenge in this relationship?
BRICS is itself a challenge, I think. But an expanded BRICS is even greater challenge, I think, because, we've always been sort of happy to be part of BRICS in a certain sense, but the expansion of BRICS, the steady expansion, you included South Africa. So it was first BRIC and then became BRICS. And then now we've included a range of countries, including Iran. If you look at it, it is, the point of view or the China focus or the Chinese influence in BRICS has increased through the partnerships that it has developed. It doesn't mean that these countries are not friendly to us. We have our own relationship, but they have a certain alignment. The Saudi move, I think the Saudis are still susceptible to US pressure, and how much they would move in that direction is a question mark. But BRICS as an organization is increasingly an anti-US forum. It's like the NAM in the old days. And so whether it would suit us to be part of a forum that is dictated only by China and Russia is a question mark. And I think this is something that we would have to see. So this is one manifestation, the Saudi thing. But I think there will be many initiatives in BRICS which would make us a little uncomfortable.
So just to say that until last month, 33 new countries have applied to join BRICS. But if you want to flip the argument around, the more countries that are in BRICS, the more difficult it would get for countries like China to convince everybody to follow, to toe the line. Because like India, Saudi Arabia, as you pointed out, or the UAE are not anti-US. They may be that big line about we are non-US, not anti-US. I think that applies to them too. And there's a whole host of them. Turkey yesterday applied to join BRICS. And Turkey is a NATO member. So I think, frankly, I think we're heading for a nice coalition. You know what Indian coalitions look like? We're heading for a nice coalition, but go ahead.
Yes, firstly, Ambassador, thank you for sharing your insights today. Very, very insightful discussion. I know we've discussed mostly on India, US, but since you spent time in Bangladesh as well, and that's, of course, our neighbor, and since most of our neighbors have become, pro-China, either because of obviously they're in debt and they need the money, so what would our role be in Bangladesh, and how do we step in or not step in because of what's happened there and the coup that's taking place? And what should India's position be so that we keep Bangladesh as one of our allies, as most of them are now turning pro-China?
So I would hesitate to call them pro-China, because what has happened is that a decade or two ago, we were the only regional power that was, let's say, very prominent in our neighborhood, maybe 2 decades ago. Today, there is a new game in town with the Chinese very much competing, for influence in our own neighborhood. So that, I think, is the new factor. Whether these countries have turned pro-China or they're pro-Indian is difficult to say. And Ambassador Sood has been in our neighborhood as well. He's been in Nepal. My own view is that, we need to play the game differently today. We are in competition with China. They have more resources than us. They have deeper pockets. They are less ideological as well. I mean, our lines of credit are very, very, subject to a lot of scrutiny. So transparency is important. The Chinese can, adjust their credit lines in whichever way suits their interests in that particular country. So you are competing not only with a country that has far greater resources, but also one that has different systems, which might in some senses be easier because you don't have the same controls and checks and balances that we have. Having said that, we probably need, because the name of the game in most countries is the neighborhood. Bangladesh is one case in point, but whether it is Nepal, whether it is Maldives, you have one party that might be closer to your interests, another party, because one party is closer to your interests, they are closer to the Chinese interests. And I think our endeavor should be to really work with all so that we can, it's easier said than done because it's a competitive game. It's not a game in which you could really rest at that. But the fact is that we need to work with all concerned. And Bangladesh is a case in point where I think a lot of eggs have been in Sheikh Hasina's basket. And correctly so, because for 15 years it suited our interests. I did write a piece in which I said that her sort of removal from power has nothing to do with our policies of supporting her. There is this point of view that India's support for her, and because India is involved, she should be out. But we've always maintained that she should be more democratic, more transparent, more accountable. So I think, the fact that she hasn't adjusted to the realities and requirements of that country has led to her ouster. Did we read the signals? Did we do whatever it takes? And what can we do now? I think is important because Bangladesh is a country with which you share the largest border of 4,000 plus kilometers. It also borders your northeastern states, so there is a level of vulnerability. And as Indrani can tell you, I think when Bangladesh can sort of tilt the other way, in other words, they're working against your interests, it can be extremely damaging to peace and stability in the northeast, I would say communal harmony also in many parts of eastern India. And I think we have to handle that with a lot of delicacy. And clearly, it can't be a normal approach. Our normal approach has been to look at Bangladesh from a 1971 perspective. Today, I think the balance of power has shifted to the other end. It's parties that had a very different perspective at that time, and organizations and entities that control that country. So I think we will have to deal with all concerned without compromising our interests. So, but it's important to engage, and it's important to, I think, make it clear that we can be useful. It can be a situation where both can help each other. It can be a win-win situation. But you need to be cognizant of our core interests. And what are our core interests in Bangladesh? One is that there should be no activity inimical to our interests from Bangladesh's territory, which means terrorism, radicalism, fundamentalism into the northeast. And the second is communal harmony. If there are attacks on minorities, especially Hindu communities, there are migrations, I think it will impact on the social fabric in our northeast, which is already very, very delicate. So I think there are implications, severe implications. And of course, ongoing cooperation. We've spent 15 years building a sort of infrastructure and system that can help us tide over changes in government in either country, especially in Bangladesh. So if we build railway lines, we build pipelines, we build energy transmission corridors, it's to benefit both countries. And I think the idea being that no government should be able to change that, because that will go fundamentally against their own interests. And I think this lot realize that. The interim administration understands it. But whether they're in full control and whether those vested interests that are out there want that reality to be understood is a different thing altogether. I mean, we have to wait and watch that space. And it's, I think, going to continue to evolve as we go along.
Did the US have a role in Hasina's ouster?
So when we spoke about 71, I think Saroni mentioned that, the 7th Fleet coming into the Bay of Bengal, I think history never actually leaves you. It's always somewhere there. And in all our conversations with the US, we have never been able to actually have identical views when it came to Bangladesh. For the simple reason that somehow that prism of 71 continues to remain. And it also remained with Hasina, who always harbored the view that in 75, her father, Mujibur Rahman's assassination had something to do with the CIA. And there's no evidence to indicate that, but everything is based on perceptions. So she could never get around that factor. The US could never get around the factor that their support groups, which continue to this day, consist of the Jamaat-e-Islami, those who traditionally maintained a contact with them, both in the US and in Bangladesh, were those who are akin to the Muslim Brotherhood. So from the US's point of view, a popular movement that brings in, even if it brings in Islamists into the fore, is something that is better than 15 years of autocratic rule, which did not suit their interests because Hasina didn't play ball with them. That's very clear. But whether they are behind it, whether they had anything to do with it, difficult to say. But one thing is for certain is that they have more influence today than they ever did. The fact that Prime Minister Modi, in his telephonic conversation with President Biden, mentioned Bangladesh and mentioned the need to work together to restore law and order and stability and to protect Hindus and the minority communities in that country indicates that the US has leverage, which, a month earlier or so, this would have been out of the question.
Well, thank you for this delightful evening. It doesn't happen very often that you get to be in company of gentlemen who have worked with, so to say, the most powerful men in the world and would also know which buttons to play to get your way through that. So, sir, my question is little bit of foresight. I know that, I gather that you do not like to place bets, but little bit of foresight, like 4 years from now, the next elections, 2028, chances are Indian government is going to be stable and 4 years will be done for whichever candidate from the US. Do you see by then there's going to be some change in the way the US and India looks at each other? And if at all it does, which are going to be the critical factors which will play a role? Is that going to be Russia's role? Is that going to be the technology? Or that's too soon for us to maybe comment on something like that? That probably is like maybe 2, 3, 4 election like series away.
Well, I think two factors that are very important in the relationship. One is the strategic factor. With the US, we have a global, comprehensive strategic partnership. It's quite a mouthful. But we have a strategic partnership with the United States. And the US looks at the relationship from strategic terms. And that's important, and I'll come to that. The other factor is a leadership connect. Well, Prime Minister Modi had a great relationship with President Obama. He had a great relationship with Trump. He has a great relationship with Biden. And one presumes that he'll have a very good relationship with Kamala Harris as well, if she becomes president. Now, what would the future hold? 4 years from now, would it be Kamala Harris? Would it be Trump? If it is Kamala Harris, 4 years from now, she will certainly contest the presidency again. Mind you, in the Democratic Party, there are many other candidates, and she was not the natural candidate. Had it been through the primaries and the normal process, I hesitate to say this, but my sense is that you could not have taken it for granted that she would have been the candidate. There was Gavin Newsom, governor of California, who was a very prominent candidate. You had Ed Shapiro, who's the governor of Wisconsin, or one of the states there. You got Gretchen Whitmer also, who's the governor of Michigan. So these are very prominent people, and there are a number of others in the Democratic field. So she would have to fight for the primaries again 4 years hence. It depends on how successful our presidency has been. And at the end of that process, before Biden passed the torch to her, her ratings were very low. They've really shot up because everybody was so ecstatic at Biden stepping down and her coming up that it really made that world of difference. But what happens 4 years from now? would depend on a number of factors. Who becomes president? Because that connect is very important. US is an executive presidency. You know, the prime minister is a primus inter pares, but the US president is an executive presidency. He takes all the decisions, especially on foreign policy. The decision making is largely with him and subject to congressional concurrence and approval. So presidency matters. So what I'm trying to say is that who becomes presidency makes that difference. And the second is, what is your approach towards the strategic partnership? Do you continue to see India as a strategic partner? Despite the, from the US's point of view, there are two main priorities. One is to contain China in the Indo-Pacific. The other is to, let's say, have some sort of a outcome that would suit their interests in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. On one of these, I think we are with them. On the other, we are not with them. Will that make a difference to the relationship? I think that point had come out earlier. So there are many factors here that would determine how that relationship looks like 4 years from now. What is in our favor is that values and principles are shared. You know, whether it's rule of law, democracy, free speech, whatever it is, we have shared values and principles. Second factor, of course, is that, you know, both of us have a common challenge and a concern. The third, of course, is that we are a large market. So, I mean, that in the US consideration, that's an important factor. A market of 1.4 billion people, a lot of them are young people, so that matters. So all of these factors, I would say, work to ensure that there's a preservation of that relationship and that we move forward. And this is not a relationship that can stay in the same place. I mean, this is what we discussed also. You have to constantly build on that relationship. Otherwise, it will falter. So I think that's also very important. So the next 4 years is going to be very important for us, and therefore this election is important. I mean, my sense is that, you know, either candidate comes in, you've got a fairly good. I mean, the only difference is that Trump is a known commodity and Kamala Harris is not known. Her positions are not known even on the domestic issues. Forget on foreign policy and on, you know, on our own relationship. In that entire debate, India didn't figure other than her origins, right? I mean, I didn't really come across any reference to India in that entire thing. But then there wasn't too much focus in foreign policy because they focused mainly on domestic issues, and that also was mainly symbolic. It was not substantive, the discussion. So we don't know her. We don't know what sort of a stand she will take, and that's why the Washington Post article is interesting, because it said there's uncertainty over a strategic stand towards India. So we don't know what her strategic stand would be. I would, if you ask me to guess, I would say that her strategic stand would follow the advice given to her by state, by the agencies, you know, by the Pentagon. And so that goes in our favor, because all of these organizations see it from a strategic perspective. But what is the influence that certain influential groups within the Democratic Party have on her? Whether that will, how would you say, that might get her to, from time to time, make statements to appease them, which might have an impact on our own response, and then therefore sort of be impediments in that relationship, that we don't know. I mean, these are hypothetical situations. But generally, I think it should be smooth sailing, and 4 years hence, we should be seeing a much stronger relationship, one that is, you know, I would say, when we discuss it next time, 4 years hence, you should be able to go to that next step. And hopefully, I'll be with Ambassador Sood looking at someone here who could give a better perspective.
Make a comment here. Yes, sir. You know, having been part of the India-US dialogue for 2 decades, which began in 1992 with the end of the Cold War, when for the first time President Bush Sr. met Prime Minister Narasimha Rao on 31st of January 1992 in New York, where, you know, they said, well, the world has changed, Soviet Union has broken down, etc., etc. And so we need to start engaging, and they decided that nuclear at that time was an issue that had been one of the most divisive issues for our two countries, and said, let's start talking about it. I continued through various ups and downs. Okay. So, fast forward to around 2004-05, when we were talking of new steps in strategic partnership, after Clinton had had his successful visit in March of 2000 to India, and a lot of the negative angst of the nuclear tests had been overcome, and we were now looking forward, as it were. And I remember going to various US universities and talking to them about the future of India-US, and I said, look, there are three things that are driving India-US relations. First, it's an end of ideology. That Cold War business that existed, Bangladesh, fallout, all of that is history. So there's no Cold War. Fine. Second, I said, Indian economy started opening up in 1991. Now, that opening up, sometimes it has moved faster, sometimes it has moved slower, depending on the government in Delhi, depending on the coalition, depending on the, the levers in that coalition and so on. But notwithstanding that, the trajectory has been positive, right? I mean, it hasn't turned negative. So sometimes it is faster, sometimes it's slow. Fine. Second, and that has enabled India's attractiveness as the market, as Ambassador Shringla said, and also an attractiveness in terms of US companies coming in and investing in India. Third, I said the third factor, which is interesting, because having been involved with India-US for such a long time, I saw it for the first time in the 1990s when Ramanand Sagar came up with Ramayana and late 80s. And suddenly the Indian diaspora woke up to Ramayana and Mahabharata and all that. See, the Indian diaspora had come of age. It's, it was in the late 1990s that we set up the caucus, the India Caucus. In the Congress, in the US Congress, you can set up. So we had a bunch of congressmen who were supportive. Remember, in early 1990s, we were under severe attack because of Kashmir, human rights, etc., etc. In 2004, in the Senate, we set up the Senate Friends of India. And Hillary Clinton was one of the co-chairs, along with Joe Cornyn from Texas. So, now you've moved a long way. Now, the Indian diaspora is going from strength to strength. So if you're looking at three driving factors, A, end of ideology, B, Indian economy opening up, 3, the strength of Indian diaspora in the US domestic politics, India-US relationships are destined to move forward, positive. I mean, I don't think there is a negative factor in that. And to add to that, if you have the US-China rivalry, well, there is no other way to look at it.
So that brings me to my last question. We haven't spoken about China. We know where Trump stands on China because, frankly, for all his unpredictability and for all his craziness, he actually put China on the mat and he focused attention on how China was gaming the international trading system. Where does Kamala stand on China? Do you know?
Well, one thing that she did say was that I'm not Joe Biden. And I think she was trying to say that Wherever his policies have faltered, I don't identify with him. But where there is a gap in her thinking, I mean, in the sense that she's not pronounced herself on many issues. On China, I think she's very clearly of the same view as Biden. I mean, I'm sorry to say there might not be a view, but in the absence of a view, you would have to assume that she'd carry forward Biden's policy, which is both contain and collaborate. In other words, you continue to contain China in terms of denying technology, whether it is semiconductors, whether it is high-level technology. You continue to hold them to account in international bodies and bilaterally, especially on things like the South China Sea and Taiwan. You continue to impose high customs duties. Mind you, Trump had imposed, as I said, $300 billion of imports from China, I mean 25% tariffs. Biden has not removed those tariffs, but he's added new tariffs. For example, electric vehicles. 100% duty on Chinese export of electric vehicles, which would have swamped the market, I guess. So there is, in a certain sense, a sort of two-pronged policy. And I think she will continue that policy of both containing China, working with partners like India, Australia, Japan, Europe, but at the same time, I think not exactly closing the door. Trump might have sounded harsher, but Trump is someone who's, again, transactional. He could work out deals, he could work out, various quid pro quos. But I think that policy of President Biden is going to be taken forward by Kamala Harris if she becomes president.
Prime Minister Modi is going to be in the US in the next 10 days. No, yeah, next 10 days. And is there, should we expect any surprises? He's going to be in Delaware for literally the last Quad summit with Biden, where Biden is a lame duck, the Japanese Prime Minister is a lame duck. That leaves only the Australian Prime Minister.
Also going to the polls.
Yes.
Soon.
So that leaves only the Australian Prime Minister and Prime Minister Modi. So what sort of a visit do you expect?
No, I think it's like a end of term thank you visit. President Biden is hosting the Quad at Wilmington, Delaware, which is his home state, and he obviously, wants to have a sort of a major event towards the end of his presidency. I think one of the reasons why this is happening also is that we would like to host the next Quad. Everybody is clear that we will host the next Quad, in which the new US president would be visiting India, for which the new US president would be visiting India. So this also is useful because otherwise we would have had to host this. So it suits both sides. President Biden has the opportunity to, I think, take the center stage again because he's completely out of the news, if you noticed. And Trump said he's spending most of his time on the beach. And he says that if you wake him up at 4 p.m. and ask him, in other words, he's asleep at 4 p.m. But whatever it is, the fact of the matter is that, he, I think, is more or less out of it. Kamala Harris is too busy campaigning, so there's a vacuum of leadership. I don't expect too many decisions. There's another conference around that, which is a
Summit of the Future.
Exactly. So that is more multilateral also. But I think the Quad would reiterate some decisions. It could even take certain positions, but I think we'll wait for the Delhi Summit of Quad for really substantive, I would say, decisions that the Quad would make. And there is one of the things that has been going around is that the Quad needs to do more to work on third countries. And one of the areas that came, I think, is being talked about is Africa. But China just had its China
FOCAC.
Forum with Africa, FOCAC. And they've pledged $59 billion. 53 of the 55 African countries went to Beijing. So there's a problem there. And the US, again, has been losing ground. We've been engaged, but we really need to work with others. Our lines of credit have actually dried up because of defaulting. I mean, many African countries have defaulted, and it's difficult for us to extend loans when those situations persist. So we have to find a way around this. And I think some of the discussions have been on some decision on Africa. But as I said, we don't expect major decisions at this point of time. We probably will wait for the Delhi summit.
Right. And on that note, I'd like to call this discussion to a close. Thank you very much, Ambassador Shringla. And thank you, everybody, for being here and for being such an engaged audience. And good evening.
Thank you.